Are you seriously doing this? The sharp, incredulous question sliced through the cool morning air, startling a few early joggers nearby. It wasn't shouted, but the tone carried enough disbelief to turn heads. Bryce Tanner, broad-shouldered, self-satisfied, and every inch the cadet who believed his pressed uniform made him untouchable, stood rigidly in front of the old man seated on the bench. The training pistol in his hand, plastic and harmless in every practical sense, looked anything but harmless pressed against the temple of an 87-year-old stranger. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories channel so you never miss these fascinating tales of courage. And let us know in the comments where you're watching today. That stranger was Harold Whitmore. He didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't even bother to look at the gun. His gaze drifted past Bryce as though the young cadet were nothing more than a minor inconvenience blocking his view of the maple trees swaying on the academy lawn. His hands rested calmly on his knees, fingers lightly curled, steady as bedrock. The calmness wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't bravado. It was something older, like someone who had long ago made peace with storms far greater than this one. Behind Bryce, the other cadets hovered in an uneasy half-circle. Daniel Peterson, the tallest but easily the most anxious, shifted from foot to foot. "Just stand up, sir," he murmured, his voice cracking despite his attempt at authority. "Show some respect so we can move on." Bryce didn't look away from Harold. "I said," he repeated, voice tightening, "are you deaf or just ignoring me?" His jaw flexed with irritation. He pressed the pistol harder against the thin, time-worn skin of Harold's temple. "I am a cadet officer of Ridgeway Military Academy. When I address you, you stand." Only then did Harold finally turn his eyes toward him. They were pale, washed-out blue, the kind that had once burned bright but had seen too many years, too many miles, too many truths the world would never fully understand. Those eyes were steady, unafraid, and far too old for this foolish display of power that it hadn't begun with a gun. It had begun with a thermostat every Tuesday morning. Harold Whitmore brought his coffee to the park bench across from the academy grounds. It was a small ritual, steady, quiet, predictable. He liked to watch the cadets run their drills on the parade field, though he never approached them. He always sat alone, always with the same faded navy windbreaker zipped up to his collarbone, always with the same worn metal pin on his lapel. He had just poured himself a steaming cup when the cadets arrived. 4 of them, confidence puffed up like they owned the world simply because they wore the uniform of young men who had yet to be tested. Bryce led the group, swaggering forward with the cocky assurance of someone who believed consequences were stories told to other people. "Look at this relic," he had said loudly enough that an elderly couple walking their dog glanced over. "Probably thinks he's still fighting in the Great War." His friends snickered, but Harold only took a slow sip of his coffee. His silence angered them more than any retort could have. They mistook it for weakness. "What's that on your jacket?" one of them asked, pointing at the tarnished pin on Harold's lapel. The eagle, globe, and anchor had long lost its shine, the details rubbed smooth by decades of wear. "Did you get that from a dollar store?" Bryce stepped closer, invading Harold's space with mock authority. "You wear outdated junk like that and expect people to thank you for your service." Harold screwed the thermos cap back on, set it beside him with deliberate care, and said quietly, "You boys should move along." Something in his tone, soft, level, utterly unimpressed, struck Bryce like an insult. Who was this frail old man to command them? Who was he to dismiss them with the same tone someone might use on a group of misbehaving children? Bryce shoved his shoulder. It wasn't hard, but it crossed a line. Harold didn't move. He absorbed the shove like a tree absorbs the wind flexing inward for only a heartbeat before returning to stillness. As he rose slowly to his feet, the cadets exchanged uncertain glances. He looked smaller than any of them, lighter, older than their grandparents. And yet, something shifted when he stood. There was a quiet, coiled presence in him that made the air feel tighter. "I won't say it again," Harold murmured. And that was enough to snap Bryce's restraint. Humiliation burned in the young cadet's throat. He couldn't tolerate being challenged, not by a classmate, not by an officer, and certainly not by an old man in a windbreaker. His face flushed red, and without thinking, without understanding the gravity of the moment, he drew the training pistol, raising it like an extension of his wounded pride. "Maybe you don't understand," he growled, stepping close enough that Harold could feel the cadet's breath. "I represent this nation. I represent the future. And you're in my way." The park fell into a hush. A woman walking her dog froze mid-stride. A man reading a newspaper slowly lowered it, eyes widening. No one moved. No one intervened. People rarely step into confrontations they don't understand, and this one defied understanding. Bryce leaned in, voice dripping with venom. "Now you're going to stand at attention. You're going to apologize. And you're going to call me sir. Do you understand?" Harold didn't respond. But inside, something shifted, something ancient and deeply buried. The cold plastic of the pistol morphed in memory into the heavy steel of an M1911. The bright park dissolved into the dense, suffocating jungles of a war fought half a century before these boys were even born. The arrogance on Bryce's face blurred into the frightened eyes of a young enemy soldier Harold had once spared, or maybe hadn't. The memories were fogged with blood and heat. But they were alive, across the street. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Frank Delaney had been approaching the newsstand when he spotted the boys crowding Harold. He stopped mid-stride the moment he saw the pistol. His heart lurched into his throat. He didn't know Harold personally, but he recognized that look, still cold, waiting. A look he had seen in men who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Frank realized something terrifying. Harold Whitmore was not in danger. The cadets were. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers, not to dial 911. The police would misunderstand this. They would handle it wrong. No, Frank called someone who would understand. Someone who might stop what could explode in the next 30 seconds. He called General Marcus Hawley. General Marcus Hawley nearly dropped his pen when he heard Frank Delaney's voice on the other end of the line. Frank wasn't a man prone to exaggeration. He didn't deal in panic. He didn't embellish. If anything, the retired lieutenant colonel was known for understating emergencies, not amplifying them. So when he spoke with that clipped urgency, each word tightened by adrenaline, Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. "Marcus, one of your cadets has a weapon pressed to an elderly man's head." For a moment, Hawley simply stared at his office wall, lined with plaques, medals, and framed photographs of graduates who had gone on to serve the country with distinction. His mind refused to connect the words with reality. "One of mine?" he asked quietly. "I'm looking at their patches right now," Frank said. "Ridgeway Academy. Your boys." There was a pause. A heavy, terrible one. Frank wasn't done. And the old man. "He's not scared, Marcus. He's calm. Too calm. If someone doesn't intervene right now, I promise you those boys are about to learn a lesson they won't walk away from." Something cold and electric shot through Marcus Hale's body. "Describe him." Hawley ordered. "Mid to late 80s, wiry, navy windbreaker. And he has a pin on his lapel, an old Marine emblem, tarnished, worn smooth." Marcus inhaled sharply. The world around him seemed to tilt. "Frank," he said slowly, "describe the pin in detail." "I just did," Frank answered. "It looks ancient. Like it's seen things most people only read about. This is serious, Marcus. He's not some confused veteran. There's something about him." But Hawley already knew. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out Frank's final words. He lowered the phone slowly, deliberately, though his spine thrummed with rising dread. The images in his mind weren't of his academy. They weren't of the present at all. They were of small, grainy black and white photographs stored in classified archives photos he had studied years ago while training for special assignment. Photos of men hardened not just by war, but by survival itself. And among those photos, there had been one face he never forgot. Without another thought, Holly barked orders to his aide. Captain Rowan assembled the command staff at the front steps. Class A uniforms. 5 minutes. And scramble a Code 1 escort to the town square. Move. The aide's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. The office erupted into motion. Marcus crossed the room in long strides, accessing the secure terminal embedded in his desk. His fingers typed authorization codes with mechanical precision. One by one, the layers of classified clearance peeled away until he reached a file sealed under multiple presidential-level locks. Operation Nightfall Ghost. Platoon, After Action Archivist Authorized Personnel O&L Wycus. Opened it. He didn't need to read the redacted paragraphs. He didn't need to decode the blurred maps or sift through the casualty lists. He looked only at the photograph attached to the header. A young Marine sergeant, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Eyes blazing with the grim determination of someone who had survived the impossible. Below the picture, the name read, Whitmore, Harold Usme Kolalsign. GHOS whispered the name like an oath. God help those boys. Minutes later, the motorcade tore down Main Street, sirens wailing in a tone reserved only for high-priority military response. Pedestrians scrambled out of the way. Startled by the sudden convoy of black SUVs and military police cruisers weaving with precision, the vehicle screeched to a stop. At the edge of the town square, the first door flew open. General Marcus. Halle stepped out. His Class A uniform immaculate, ribbons glinting under the morning sun. His face was carved from iron-controlled, composed, but burning with a fury that made seasoned officers flinch up behind him. His entire senior staff poured out, forming an imposing phalanx of authority. These were men and women used to commanding battalions, not standing in public squares, but today, none of them questioned why they were here. Marcus didn't spare them a glance. His eyes locked instantly onto the scene several yards. Away. 4 cadets, one old man, a plastic training pistol pressed to his temple. And Harold Whitmore standing in absolute stillness. The wind brushing the red maple leaves behind him. His expression unreadable. Hale's boots struck the grass with deliberate, measured force. The cadets froze. Bryce Tanner's bravado drained from his face so quickly it left him ghost pale. The pistol slipped slightly as his hand trembled. Even Daniel Peterson, who had warned Bryce moments earlier, looked sick, like he might be witnessing the unraveling of his own future. Marcus Halle didn't look at them. He walked straight to Harold Whitmore. Stopped 3 feet away. The crowd held its breath, then like a thunderclap masked behind complete silence, Hale snapped into a salute so rigid and precise that even his senior officers stared in disbelief. Sergeant Major Whitmore. Hale's voice boomed across the square. General Marcus Halle, Commandant of Ridgeway Military Academy. It is an honor, sir. A ripple of shock passed through the watching civilians. People gasped. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, that old man is a soldier?" Bryce Tanner looked as though someone had driven a spike through his chest, but Halle wasn't finished, still holding the salute. His voice took on a reverent weight that carried to every corner of the park. Harold Ghost Whitmore, United States Marine Corps, retired. Recipient of the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 14 Purple Hearts. Sole survivor of the Ghost Platoon during Operation Nightfall. The announcements hit like blows. The cadets swayed on their feet. Woman near the fountain covered her mouth with both hands. Even Frank Delaney Watching from across the street, closed his eyes in silent acknowledgement. Holly finally lowered his salute. But his posture remained rigid, respect radiating from every inch of him. "You are not merely a veteran, Sergeant Major," he said quietly. "You are the benchmark by which every man and woman in uniform measures themselves." Only then did he turn to Bryce Tanner. The warmth vanished from Hale's expression. He regarded Bryce not as a cadet, not even as a child, but as someone who had committed an unforgivable trespass. "Cadet," Holly said, his voice going cold as steel. "State your name." Bryce swallowed, unable to find his voice. "But Bryce Tanner, sir." "You put a weapon to the head of a legend," Holly said, eyes narrowing. "You disgraced your uniform. You disgraced this institution. And you disgraced the Marine Corps whose emblem this man defended with his own blood." Bryce's legs nearly buckled. Holly nodded once to his aide. "Captain Rowan, take them. All 4. Effective immediately. They are expelled from Ridgeway Military Academy. Escort them off the grounds and ensure their records reflect conduct unbecoming in irreversible permanent terms." Peterson whispered a quiet, broken "Sir." "Please." But the majors escorting them didn't slow. Their futures folded in on themselves before they even began, and as they were led away, Harold finally spoke, his voice gravelly but steady. "They're just boys, General. Pride can trick a young man into thinking he's bigger than he is. But pride without honor leads nowhere." Holly bowed his head, absorbing the words with solemn respect, and the entire town square felt the weight of that truth settle over them like a quiet, undeniable judgment. For a long moment after the cadets were escorted away, the park remained suspended in a strange, reverent stillness. The morning breeze rustled the maple leaves overhead, the only sound brave enough to move through the heavy quiet that lingered. Harold Whitmore did not speak immediately. He stood with his hands lightly clasped behind his back, shoulders straight, gaze fixed on a place far beyond the town square, as if the general's arrival had simply reminded him of a duty he thought he'd left buried decades earlier. General Holly took a small step closer, lowering his voice. "Sergeant Major, I owe you more than an apology. Ridgeway owes you more than an apology." Harold blinked slowly, as though returning from a long distance. When his eyes finally shifted toward Holly, there was no anger there, only a faint weariness, softened by something like understanding. "I wasn't looking for an apology, General. I only came for my coffee." Holly exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Somehow, that single sentence, quiet, almost humorous in its simplicity, felt heavier than the entire confrontation that had preceded it. Frank Delaney approached then, his steps hesitant, careful, as though approaching a grizzly bear rather than a wiry man in his late 80s. "Harold," he said, voice low with an old soldier's respect, "didn't expect to run into you here. Hell of a morning." Harold gave him a small nod. "Morning, Frank." Frank glanced at the spot where Bryce had stood moments earlier. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Harold answered. But the answer was more for the crowd's benefit than his own. Something in his posture, subtle, nearly imperceptible, suggested that the moment the gun touched his temple, a floodgate of memories had opened, and they had not closed yet. General Holly noticed it too. "Sergeant Major," he said carefully, "if there's anything you need medical assistance, transport, and escort home." Harold waved a hand gently. "I can walk home just fine." Yet he didn't turn to leave. Not immediately. Instead, he let his eyes drift toward the bench where his coffee still sat, steam curling from the thermos cap he had forgotten to tighten. He walked back to it in slow, measured steps, the general and Frank following at a respectful distance. When he sat, he sighed softly, a long, tired sound that seemed to deflate the tension still hanging in the air. The crowd began to disperse, reassured now that the crisis had ended. Parents took their children by the hand, whispering explanations. A dog barked, tugging at its leash. The mundane rhythm of the park slowly reassembled itself, but around Harold and the two men standing beside him, time felt thicker, more deliberate. Frank broke the silence first, his tone subdued. "How long have you been carrying that pin, Harold?" Harold looked down at it, turning the small emblem between his fingers. The metal was so worn it was nearly smooth, the once sharp lines softened into the curves of memory. 64 years, he answered quietly. "Give or take." Hawley studied the pin with a solemn expression. "That's not the standard issue one from your citation ceremony," he noted. "No," Harold said, voice thinning with something fragile. "This one was given to me by someone who didn't make it home." The general nodded slowly, not pressing further. Harold didn't elaborate, not yet. But memories pressed at him soft, insistent. Heavy as rain clouds dot, he could smell the jungle again if he let himself. He could hear the distant echo of his captain's voice. He could feel the weight of responsibility in his palms. Today, he told himself silently. Not here, still. The present refused to fully pull him back. General Hawley lowered himself onto the far end of the bench, leaving space a gesture of respect. "Sergeant Major," when Frank described the pin, I knew exactly who he was talking about. "We studied your platoon's reports and advanced leadership training." "Ghost Platoon is gone," Harold finished for him. "All but me." Hale's chest tightened at the bluntness. Frank looked away, guilt flickering across his face despite knowing it was not his burden to carry. Harold poured himself another cup of coffee. His hands steady, even as emotion moved behind his eyes like a tide turning. "You know," he said softly, "I never wore this to be recognized. I wore it to remember. The men I led. The men we lost. They deserve that much." His voice grew quieter. They deserved better than to be mocked by boys who don't know what the uniform means. Hawley bowed his head. "And they will learn, Sergeant Major. I will personally ensure it." Harold gave a faint nod. He didn't thank the general. Respect between soldiers didn't require words that small. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee, the steam rising against the cold air. "I wasn't angry at the boy," Harold said after a moment. "Not at first. Arrogance is common in youth. But the second he touched that pin," he inhaled deeply. "That's when I remembered things I try hard not to." Frank placed a steadying hand on the back of the bench. "You shouldn't have had to remember any of that today." Harold's gaze went distant again, drifting somewhere past the tree line, far away from the gentle quiet of the town park. "War doesn't leave you, Frank. You know that." He tapped his temple lightly. "It just waits until you least expect it." The general's jaw tightened. "If those cadets had pushed you any further," Harold cut him off with a small wry exhale. "You don't need to finish that sentence, General. I already know." Hawley didn't argue. For a few minutes, none of them spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was the kind that comes naturally to men who have seen their share of horrors and learned to survive them. Finally, Hawley stood, adjusting his uniform. "Sergeant Major Whitmore, would you allow us to escort you home?" Harold shook his head. "No need. I've walked this path for years." "At least let us accompany you as far as the street," Frank offered. "It would look strange to the public if we left the most decorated Marine in the county sitting here alone after a morning like this." Harold huffed a soft laugh. "Fair enough." He rose slowly from the bench. The general and Frank kept a respectful half-step behind him as they walked toward the edge of the park. But as Harold stepped into the sunlight, he paused, eyes narrowing just slightly, as if some quiet ache or unspoken memory tugged at him. "General," he said without turning, "those boys, what will happen to them?" Hawley answered honestly, "Their futures may look different now, but consequences teach more than comfort ever will." Harold nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Good. Maybe they'll grow into the men that uniform needs." The general exchanged a glance with Frank, Both understood the gravity of that blessing, given quietly. Without ceremony, yet heavier than any reprimand, Harold took a few more steps, but then stopped again. This time, he wasn't thinking of the cadets. He was thinking of a jungle, a hill, a captain's dying breath. Some debts, he murmured, almost to himself, last a lifetime. Neither man beside him replied. Some truths were not meant to be answered. The walk from the park to the edge of Maple Street wasn't long, maybe 200 yards at most, but for Harold Whitmore, it stirred memories he had spent a lifetime carefully walling off. Each step carried with it the faint echo of boots on foreign soil, of whispered radio calls, of the metallic scent of a battlefield that refused to fade no matter how many decades passed. General Holly and Frank matched his pace, one on each side, never crowding him, never rushing him. They walked as though escorting not a fragile elder, but a man whose shadow stretched farther than any uniformed leader in their generation. Civilians moved aside with quiet curiosity, some lifting their phones hesitantly before thinking better of it. There was something in Harold's posture, upright, deliberate, that discouraged spectacle. Halfway down the walkway, Harold slowed. It wasn't fatigue. His pace remained steady. It was memory catching him by the collar. He could hear it again, the rain on corrugated metal, the distant thud of mortar. He could smell the mud. He could feel the weight of the dying captain's hand closing his fingers around that pin. He stopped walking completely. Frank, noticing the shift, paused beside him. "Harold, you all right?" Harold didn't answer immediately. His fingers brushed the eagle, globe, and anchor pinned to his windbreaker, as though reminding himself it was still there, still real. Finally, without looking at either man, he spoke quietly. "You ever wonder," he murmured, "why some men come home and the others don't?" Frank exchanged a quick glance with Hale, one heavy with understanding. "Every day," Frank answered softly. Hale's voice followed, controlled but edged with something more personal. "The ones who come back, they carry the memory of the others because no one else will." Harold nodded faintly. That truth had lived inside him for over 6 decades. They resumed walking, but the weight in the air had thickened. It settled on their shoulders like a ghost walking beside them. By the time they reached the corner of Maple and Fifth, Harold finally slowed again, turning toward them with a measured breath. "Gentlemen," he said, voice level but softer than before, "I appreciate the escort, but this is where I part ways with you." Holly straightened, almost as if responding to an unspoken command. "If you ever need anything, I know." Harold offered him a small, tired smile. "And I'm grateful. But today, I need to walk the rest alone." Frank hesitated. "You sure?" "After what happened." Harold's smile deepened, lines creasing at the corners of his eyes. "Frank, I've faced worse mornings." That earned a quiet laugh from all three. It broke some of the tension, though not all of it. Holly extended his hand. Harold clasped it, a firm, steady grip that spoke of a strength that hadn't dimmed despite time's attempts. "Sergeant Major Whitmore," Holly said, "you honored all of us today." Harold shook his head. "No, I simply held my ground. You're the one who restored what needed restoring." Holly bowed his head. "Take care of yourself, sir." Harold turned to Frank next, and for a moment, their eyes held, two men separated by war eras, yet bound by the same unspoken understanding. "Good seeing you again," Harold said. "You too," Frank replied, voice tight with sincerity. "Don't be a stranger." No promises were made, no reassurances exchanged. That wasn't how men like them communicated. Harold simply nodded once, stepped off the curb, and continued walking down the quiet residential street. Holly and Frank watched until his figure grew smaller, swallowed slowly by the rows of maple trees lining the sidewalk. Only when Harold disappeared around the bend did Frank release a heavy breath. "Marcus, he's hurting." Maybe not from what happened today, but from everything before it. I know, Halle murmured. You don't survive what he survived without carrying ghosts. Frank nodded. He didn't look surprised, you know. Not when that boy put the pistol to him. Not even when you arrived. Like he's lived through worse 100 times. Hale's expression darkened. He has. Frank looked at him sideways. You read his file. You've seen what he did. Halle paused, considering his words. Saw enough to know he should have never been left alone in a park while children play pretend at being soldiers. Frank gave a humorless chuckle. Arrogant kids with fake guns. The world doesn't realize how close it came to losing 4 cadets today. Harold wasn't the one in danger. No, Halle agreed. He wasn't. They walked together back toward the Academy's motorcade. Both men carrying different pieces of the same truth. Meanwhile, Harold turned left onto Sycamore Lane, the morning sun now climbing higher, warming the pavement beneath his slow, steady steps. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with modest single-story homes that had stood unchanged for decades. Harold passed Mrs. Hanley's porch, where the old wooden swing creaked in the breeze. He passed the corner house belonging to Mr. Turner, who always watered his lawn at precisely 7 each morning. These familiar sights grounded him, but they didn't ease the heaviness growing in his chest. About a block from his home, Harold paused again, gripping the railing of a small footbridge that crossed a narrow drainage creek. The water trickled quietly beneath him, soft, rhythmic, steady. For reasons he couldn't articulate, Harold found himself staring at the rippling surface dot, and then, without warning, memory overtook him. The water-darkened dot had thickened with mud. Screams echoed in the distance, thin, desperate. The rustle of jungle leaves whispered around him. Gunfire cracked like snapping branches. A young Marine fell at his feet, blood soaking through his uniform. Harold's breath hitched. His grip tightened on the railing until his knuckles whitened. He shut his eyes. Not here. Not now. Not again. He inhaled slowly once, twice before forcing his mind back into the quiet of Sycamore Lane. When he opened his eyes, the water was just water, clear, harmless. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A wind chime rattled gently. Life continued, unaware of the battles replaying behind Harold's closed expression. He released the railing and resumed walking. By the time he reached his small, beige house at the end of the street, Harold's breathing had steadied, but the heaviness remained coiled deep within his chest. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and hung his windbreaker on the hook beside the entryway carefully, deliberately. As though removing a piece of armor, he stood there for a long moment, eyes lingering on the tarnished Marine emblem that had glinted in the dim hallway light. Patient and silent. Finally, Harold whispered to it, though the room was empty. "I'm trying," he murmured. "I really am." The pin, worn smooth by decades of memory, seemed to shimmer like an echo of a promise made long ago. The house was quiet, too quiet. Harold closed the door behind him and let the soft click settle through the narrow hallway. The walls, decorated with framed photographs faded by time, seemed to breathe with him, as though the home itself exhaled after witnessing the long, fractured morning. He stepped out of his shoes carefully, almost ritualistically, and walked toward the small living room where sunlight pooled on the hardwood floor. The room was modest, an old recliner with worn armrests, a wooden coffee table scarred by years of use, and a bookshelf lined with paperbacks whose spines had curled from reading and rereading. None of it felt heavy or cluttered. It was a quiet man's home, one who cherished simplicity because life had taught him that everything else could vanish overnight. Harold moved toward the mantel above the fireplace. There, centered among a few well-kept keepsakes, sat a small lacquered box. He didn't open it. He simply rested his fingers lightly on its lid, tracing the smooth curve with a touch reverent as prayer. Inside were the real medals, The ones he never wore. The ones he could never look at. For more than a moment, he whispered, "Still here," as though updating an old friend who had waited patiently for decades. The events at the park had shaken loose memories he'd spent years packing away, and they now drifted through his thoughts like old ghosts pacing familiar hallways. He sat at his recliner, sinking slowly into the deep cushion, letting the weight of the morning settle onto him like dust. A soft tapping broke the silence. Harold opened his eyes. Another knock, gentle, unsure. Not the knocking of an officer delivering orders, nor of neighbors stopping by unannounced. It was hesitant, as though the caller wasn't convinced he should be there. Harold stood and walked to the door, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. He opened it slowly. On the porch stood Bryce Tanner. His uniform was gone, replaced by jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and eyes red-rimmed from what looked like either sleeplessness or shame, likely both. His posture was slumped, hands tucked into his pockets, the bravado stripped away entirely. He looked painfully young now, like a boy who just learned the world wasn't shaped to match his imagined place in it. For a long moment, neither spoke. Bryce swallowed, visibly forcing the words up his throat. "Sir, I know I shouldn't be here. They told me I had no right to seek you out, that I needed to report back to my parents immediately." He paused, face twisting. "But I needed to apologize. Not the kind they make you practice in training. A real one." Harold studied him, his expression unreadable. Bryce shifted as if standing under a weight only he could feel. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just didn't want the last time you saw me to be," his voice cracked. "That person." Harold let the silence stretch, not to intimidate, but to measure the truth in the boy's posture, tone, trembling hands. Then he stepped aside. "You can come in," he said simply. Bryce blinked in surprise. "Sir, I don't deserve." "Son," Harold muttered softly, "if life only gave us what we deserve, most of us wouldn't make it past 20. Bryce hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The living room's warmth seemed to envelop him. He stood awkwardly near the coffee table, unsure whether to sit until Harold gestured to the recliner opposite his. "Have a seat." Bryce lowered himself slowly, shoulders hunched. He looked around the room as though expecting to see newspaper clippings or framed certificates celebrating Harold's service. But there were none. Only photographs, simple ones of landscapes, old friends, and a single black and white picture of a platoon lined up in a muddy jungle clearing. Bryce stared at that photo. "Is that them?" Harold followed his gaze. "That was Ghost Platoon. The day before we lost the hill." The boy swallowed hard. Harold took a deep breath. "What happened this morning, what you did, was reckless, dangerous. But it wasn't born from cruelty. It came from ignorance. And ignorance can be fixed." He leaned back slightly. "If you want it to be." Bryce stared at the floor. "I do. I really do. I didn't understand what the uniform meant. I thought respect came with it automatically. I never realized you had to earn it." Harold's voice softened. "We all think like that when we're young. The trick is not staying that way." Bryce's eyes filled but didn't spill. "I don't know what my future looks like now. They said I'm expelled permanently. No chance of reapplying." "That may be true," Harold replied gently. "But life isn't measured by one path. Sometimes the path we think is ours was never meant to be." Bryce looked up, desperate. "What do I do now?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the mantel, and lifted the small lacquered box into his hands. He didn't open it, just held it. "You learn," he said. "You pick yourself up, and you become someone worth following, even if no one is behind you yet." He placed the box back down. "And you start by understanding this. Humility builds stronger men than pride ever will." Bryce nodded, tears finally slipping down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I truly am. Harold stepped forward. He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness offered not lightly, but with intention. I know, Harold said. And that's a start. Bryce wiped his face quickly. Is there anything I can do? Anything to make things right? Harold thought for a long moment, then pointed to the framed photograph of his platoon on the wall. You can learn their names. Bryce followed his gaze, eyes widening. And learn what real sacrifice looks like, Harold continued quietly. Learn who wore the uniform before you, what they gave, what they lost. And if one day you still feel called to serve, whether as a soldier or simply as a decent man, you'll do it for the right reasons. Bryce nodded, his jaw firming with something steadier than guilt. I will. Harold offered his hand. Bryce took it. Their handshake was slow, steady, transformational. When Bryce left the house, sunlight met his face like a clean slate. He stepped off the porch taller, not because he'd regained anything from his former pride, but because Harold had given him a chance to rebuild. Instead, Harold watched him walk away, then closed the door gently. He leaned against it for a moment, the exhaustion of the day settling through his bones. But there was something else to something lighter than the heaviness he'd carried for years. He walked back to the mantel and rested his hand on the lacquered box once more. This time he opened it. Inside, the metals glimmered softly. Harold didn't touch them. He simply looked. Maybe, he whispered into the quiet room, there's still a little more I can give. And for the first time in a long time, the weight of memory felt just a little easier to bear.